Scientists study the fossilized remains of plants and animals to learn about the Earth's history. What happened at the end of the Cretaceous period some 65 million years ago to doom dinosaurs to extinction? At the end of the Cretaceous period, some 65 million years ago, much of life on Earth was doomed to extinction. But why? Perhaps you've heard the theory many scientists accept as plausible. A huge meteorite 10 kilometers wide and weighing 450 million kilograms slammed into Earth, leaving a crater the size of Delaware in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. One strong piece of evidence supports this theory. An element called iridium has been discovered in a layer of clay virtually circling the globe. It shouldn't be here. Iridium is rare on Earth and common in, you guessed it, meteorites. And the layer and the crater all date back, conveniently, about 65 million years. So the theory that a gigantic meteor hit holds up. But did the impact cause the widespread extinction of life? Searching for clues, one paleontologist, Kirk Johnson, has wandered North Dakota's Badlands collecting plants. He's gathered 30,000 fossilized specimens to date.
Dinosaurs are sexy, there's no question about that, but they're quite rare and they're a lot of work. Fossil leaves tell you a real different story. They give you the context. I mean, if you look at the world today, it's a green planet, and plants cover the surface of the Earth. Plants are living in environments and responding to them, so you can learn quite a bit from the world from looking at the plants. You look at this leaf, for instance, it's got a smooth margin, an elongate pointed tip, and that's the kind of leaf you find today in tropical rainforests, areas that have a lot of rainfall and ample temperatures. They don't get too cold in the winter, and there's always water around. It's really different than what it is here today.
Many scientists have looked at such evidence and concluded that the mass extinction in the late Cretaceous period came about because the meteorite's impact clouded the Earth and left it dark and bitterly cold. But there are some contradictory clues up north. University of California's Bill Clemens found a host of dinosaur bones in Alaska's far north, where it was colder and darker than in tropical climates. So at least these cold-adapted dinosaurs should have survived.
But actually, the opposite occurs. Dinosaurs become extinct, turtles and crocodiles survive, which tells us then that it wasn't extreme cold or extreme darkness that caused the extinction of these beasts.
If it wasn't extreme cold or extreme darkness that killed off the dinosaurs, perhaps it was the opposite. Maybe the meteorites smashed billions of tons of bedrock and released enough carbon dioxide to trap heat and make the planet too hot for most species. One thing is clear, we wouldn't be here if the dinosaurs were still around. After mass extinctions, survivors seem to have a new lease on life. With the destruction of dominant competitors and predators, different species flourish. Small mammals had nibbled at the edges of a world dominated by dinosaurs for more than 100 million years. But when the dinosaurs died out, mammals multiplied and diversified. Birds also evolved from ancient reptiles and flourished. The dinosaur disaster turned out to be a lucky break for the ancestors of modern species.
Okay, guys, today we're going to talk about Earth's long history. We'll try and talk about the different parts of geological time and go through some of the things that have lived on our planet. There's a picture of me there on the edge of the Grand Canyon. I'm on the south rim hanging out there. It is a long, long, long ways down. But one of the neat things about the Grand Canyon is that as you look at the layers of rock there, you can see I'm sitting on one, but I mean, that could be anywhere from, 10 million to even hundreds of millions of years worth of time there that I'm sitting on top of. But as you walk down the canyon, you literally peel back the pages of Earth's history, with the youngest stuff being on top, and by the time we get to the bottom, we're talking about billions and billions of years old. So it's pretty neat to go there and actually see all that. So we're going to start kind of at the bottom and work our way up here with Precambrian history. So the oldest time frame that we really talk about on our planet is called the Precambrian. So it's the time that happened before what we're going to talk about as the Cambrian period. So this is an immense amount of time. It's tremendously long compared to the other periods of time that we separate Earth's history into. It begins all the way back about 4.56 billion years ago when the Earth formed. So we're gonna walk through some time here. The rocks that we have in the Precambrian are what we refer to as the shields. These are large flat expanses. They're really ancient rock. They're the stuff that in most places is at the very, very bottom. It's typically metamorphic. It can be igneous. It's so old it's been squished and cooked quite a bit. But what we know about the Precambrian comes from rock that we've mined most of the time deep down from these shields. They're all over the world too. Like in North America, there's the Canadian Shield, which is a whole bunch of igneous rock that's up north in Canada, and it continues down underneath parts of America. It's just buried. It's exposed a little bit in Canada. So let's take a look at the entirety of time here, starting from the Hadean all the way on up through the Phanerozoic. You can see there where it shows eons there. The Precambrian is that time period that we collectively refer to as basically the time before the Cambrian. You can see it purple there is the Cambrian, and everything before that, starting from the Hadean all the way up through the Proterozoic, is some very, very ancient time. Just really quick, the Hadean is it refers to Hades or hell, the time on Earth when things were fairly molten and the Earth was cooling, when it was very first forming. Our first single-celled organisms show up in what we call the Archean, and the Proterozoic is when we start to see some of the near the end of it, we start to see some of the very, very first multi-celled organisms. So we'll kind of roll that all the way up, going through the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, the Cenozoic. I guess really in brief, those three eras are collectively known as the Phanerozoic, or the visible life. So the Paleozoic is also known as ancient life. The Mesozoic is known as middle life, and the Cenozoic is known as recent life. So in those three groupings, basically the Paleozoic is a lot of stuff when it was in the ocean. We have stuff emerging onto land. We have the formation of fishes, amphibians, sort of all that stuff. And then the Mesozoic is the time of the reptiles. So this is the dinosaurs, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. And finally, the Cenozoic, recent time. It consists of both the Tertiary and the Quaternary periods. And this is also known as the Age of the Mammals. And humans show up there right at the very, very end. None of this is to scale, by the way. To the far right, you can kind of see the Precambrian roughly to scale. It's really not quite right. The Cenozoic would be very, very thin, much thinner than what it is there, and the Precambrian would be a bit larger. But let's push on forward here. Looking at those ancient shields, the Canadian Shield that I mentioned is mostly granite. We studied that rock, and it actually extends up into Greenland. Those used to be connected at one point in time, so you can actually see where they're connected just by looking at the shields. There's shields all over the planet in different places, but that's our remnant of ancient rock. So if you're looking like, where's the oldest rock on the planet? Canada has some very, very old exposed rock. Australia has insanely old exposed rock. Greenland. Those are sort of the places we go to see the oldest rock on the planet. Let's flip through to Precambrian history here. So during the early formation of Earth, we did not have the same atmosphere we have today. It's changed quite a bit. The earliest atmosphere was very similar to what we see erupted out of volcanoes. So water vapor, which is most of the white steam that you see coming out of the top of a volcano. Carbon dioxide, can't really breathe that stuff too well, it's not too good for us. Warms up our atmosphere, right? Nitrogen, most common gas in our atmosphere, like 78% or so. And then there's lots of other trace gases, but the important thing is the earlier atmosphere had zero oxygen, none. And that's important for kind of a lot of reasons. First of all, we couldn't have lived in that kind of an atmosphere. But secondly, a lot of the reactions that took place to give rise to life as we know it required an atmosphere that didn't have a lot of oxygen. Oxygen is like terribly reactive stuff. It just likes to burn. You put it in contact with anything, and it likes to have a chemical reaction. So having a lot of that stuff absent from the early Earth probably helped the formation of life in some big ways. Then as we kind of move through through the Precambrian time, the development of life that could do photosynthesis really changed our atmosphere. It's what started releasing the oxygen. And it wasn't plants that did this originally. Eventually plants are going to do this. But originally it was the tiny little colonies of bacteria living in the oceans, releasing oxygen as their waste product of photosynthesis. And so that was a pretty big deal. It took a long time. It took until about 2.5 billion years ago for enough oxygen to begin to accumulate in any amounts that were important at all in the atmosphere. So originally this is happening in the oceans with a type of fossil that we call a stromatolite. So stromatolites for a long time weren't even recognized as fossils. They're just kind of like layered bands of rock until we actually found them still alive today in places like Shark's Bay, Australia. We didn't really recognize that they were living things. The stromatolite itself is kind of just like a mound, but it's a layer after layer of bacteria that grow in colonies in these shallow ocean waters, and they do photosynthesis, and as more mud and silt get trapped on them, they grow through that and make another layer, and they keep doing photosynthesis. So essentially, they're also known as blue-green algae, but technically they're actually bacteria. So anyway, this is what formed our first atmosphere. Getting into the Paleozoic, okay, after this long Precambrian time, we're looking at about 540 million years ago. There's three eras of the Paleozoic. There's three eras: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. This first one we're talking about is the Paleozoic, starting at about 540 million years ago. So during the Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian periods, there's this big supercontinent that starts to form. It's known as Gondwana. Some people call it Gondwana land. It encompasses 5 continents that are around today: South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, and then part of Asia. Let's take a look at Gondwana land. So here's Gondwana down here in the south. You can see it's stretched a bit because of the way we draw our globe, but there's a lot of continents that are part of that. So this is not yet the supercontinent of Pangaea that I'm sure you have heard of. Pangaea doesn't form until later, but parts of it are getting put together here. And you can actually see where North America and Europe is right now. North America is kind of tilted a little bit. We're going to move a lot. Like, things are really going to move around before we end up creating Pangaea. But let's kind of move through here. This is a Silurian period. Okay, looking at the Paleozoic, it was really restricted to the seas. Like, living creatures, a thriving Paleozoic community might have looked something like this. We've got nautiloids down there swimming around, probably the hunters of the deep. Kind of look like tentacles coming out of their heads. They're cephalopods. They've got this long test. We've got a trilobite there up above the nautiloid. There's all sorts of weird corals, horn corals, colonial corals, all sorts of weird stuff down there. But in many ways, parts of it look a lot like life that you might expect to see in the bottom of the ocean today. I mean, it's very different, but it looks vastly different from the life that was happening in the Cambrian period. So, and in the very early stages of the Cambrian especially. So let's kind of move along here. Late into the Paleozoic, Laurasia forms. It's another large continental landmass, and it's going to make up the northern part of what we're going to call Pangaea, which consists of present-day North America and Eurasia, which is short for Europe and Asia. So by the end of the Paleozoic, so this is the end of the middle period of life, basically, all the continents have fused into this big supercontinent that we now know as Pangaea. Let's take a look at a photo here. This is a little confusing. It goes from the top to the bottom, so if you read it from top to bottom, you're going forwards in time. So going all the way back to 410 million years ago in the Devonian period, we've got Laurasia, we've got Gondwana there, and those things are going to start to come together. In the Mississippian, 330 million years ago, they've actually started to really form into a big continent, and by the Permian, like we've got full-on Pangaea. Pangaea is Latin, by the way, for all land, so it's a time when all of the land masses are stuck together. And you can see where North America is. You can see Australia there, Antarctica, India, they're all stuck together. Remember, India is going to move far, far north and basically collide and create the Himalayan mountains. So it's going to really, really move quite a bit. And of course, South America to Africa, we're all going to split apart there. All right, so this is the end of the Paleozoic. In the late Paleozoic, we're talking about 400 million years ago. The plants are now on land. They're surviving kind of at the water's ledge and move inland to become more true land plants. So you can imagine, like, life really was living in the ocean side. Diversifying onto land was a humongous deal. Through the route of the fishes arise the amphibians, and they rapidly diversify and also take over the land. And the amphibians are what we're going to see eventually develop into the reptiles. So here's a picture of one of those early armor-plated fish. It's pretty goofy looking. It's pretty bad drawing for the most part, but they were weird. They had some big armor plating across their top sections. Some of them were quite large, really interesting looking creatures. During this time, we've also got a lot of the coal and oil forming on our planet, which we use that stuff today, right? We mine it. It's our fossil fuels. It's what we drive our cars with. The important thing to recognize here is that we don't have like endless reserves of this stuff. There's a lot of it buried that we keep digging up, but it almost all formed during what's known as the Carboniferous Period, a time when lots of the Earth was very swampy, very warm, sitting on the equator. These particular types of trees grew, they died, they fell into swamps, they got buried, they became coal, they became oil. Other little creatures living in the oceans grew and died and sank, and also became our deep sea oil reserves. So that stuff's happening today, but not at the rates that it did back then during the Paleozoic. So coming up to the end of the Paleozoic, the very end of the Paleozoic is marked with the biggest extinction of all time. Okay, it's the biggest one. There's been 5 big mass extinctions, and the End Paleozoic, the Permian mass extinction, is sometimes referred to as the Great Dying. Like, a lot of stuff dying. I'm trying to remember here, but I want to say it was somewhere in the rounds of like 90% of all life in the oceans died, like 60 or 70 or something percent of all land life died, and it's still pretty unknown as to really what caused that. We can point out a couple of factors. We can definitely point at things like massive climate change, situations like that, but really we're not exactly sure what caused this one. Now there's other extinctions that we know very well what caused, and we're going to come up on one here in a moment as we dive into the Mesozoic. So entering the Mesozoic. In the Mesozoic, this is the true age of the reptiles, the ruling reptiles, the dinosaurs. These are land-dwelling reptiles that just thrived and ruled during the Mesozoic. And I know you've seen enough videos of dinosaurs to know what they look like. But what's going on here with the planet now at this time is Pangea is actually starting to break up. So just as the dinosaurs are kicking off, and mammals are in here too, mammals are just starting off as well, we see the breakup of this big supercontinent. And then the pretty rapidly through geological time, all the continents are going to move towards their present positions as they are today. So you might be wondering, can that happen again? Can we get another Pangea? We absolutely will have another Pangea. There's little doubt that that's going to happen. Guessing exactly where it's going to be and what it's going to look like, nobody can say that for sure. But the plates of the Earth are still moving, and as long as they do that, things are going to collide and come back together and move apart again. So let's look at the Mesozoic. The Mesozoic is pretty spectacular. Gymnosperms, naked seed plants, are growing, and they can get quite a bit taller than other plants can get, and so they're capable of having some water-free fertilization. So because they have seeds, they don't need to have their sperm actually swim to their eggs, like for instance algae or things like that might have to have happen. And they very, very rapidly come to dominate the Mesozoic era. So if you looked at the plants during the times of the dinosaurs, they would be looking a little more familiar, but they'd still be pretty bizarre compared to the plants we have today. So, the Canadian Rockies are forming, okay, throughout the Cretaceous, so that's all thrusting up because of the collisions. During the Mesozoic, we actually see the formation of the shelled egg. So the amniotic egg was a big deal to begin with, but you wrap a shell around it, and now reptiles can actually lay eggs on land. They don't have to go back to the water. So that allows them to push further inland. It's a huge adaptation for them. They no longer have to go to the water to lay their eggs and then go through some weird stage where for part of their lifetime they're a tadpole and then they turn into something else, and so it's a pretty big leap for life, moving to this egg. And you may not know this, but early mammals, the monotremes especially, also laid eggs. And we still have things like the duck-billed platypus and the echidna, the anteater, the spiny anteater, that do lay eggs today. So it's not a lost art among mammals to do that. And of course we also have the mammals with the pouches, right, the marsupials. And then there are the ones that are like us. So let's move along here. The reptiles come to dominate, right? This shelled egg really helps. By the end of the Mesozoic, there's loads and loads of them, but lots of them are becoming extinct. Okay, we're going to see a mass extinction event. And there's some evidence that even before the big extinction, some groups of dinosaurs were starting to dwindle some. So there's a lot of stuff going on, not just the big end impact that we'll talk about here in a second. Mention a couple of big ones here that were pretty exciting. The pterodactyls, right? This is Pteranodon, one of the giant flying pterosaurs. And there's quite a bit of question about how some of these even were able to take off on the planet. Could they have taken off if they were on the ground? Did they have to survive on cliffs and glide out from the cliffs? Really interesting creatures. By the way, this is not the group that birds develop from, right? Not at all. A lot of us know that birds are actually dinosaurs, but they're related to the dinosaurs that are down the lineage of things like T-Rex. So not at all from these guys, but they were flyers. Here's one of the larger extinct crocodile skulls. Okay, and here we are into the Cenozoic. So into the Cenozoic, right before the Cenozoic, there is a massive extinction. Right, it's not as big as the Permian that we just talked about, but the end of the time of the dinosaurs, the end of the Cretaceous, is a humongous mass extinction, and that extinction made a big difference for us. It was, as far as we understand it, there was a big meteor from space that struck the Earth, blocked out the sun, through humongous tidal waves across the oceans. We know where the site of this thing struck. It struck right off the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula, down in Mexico, and it was a planet-wide event. It blocked out the sun. The plants that made that were the producers at the bottom of the food chain, they all died off because there was no sun. The big giant organisms, big giant animals, dinosaurs that ate plants all died. The big giant meat eaters that ate the plant eaters that ate the plants all died. So virtually everything that was larger than, say, a modern day deer pretty much got wiped out. It was a big event. Now, at the time, mammals were very tiny things. They were little, think like shrew-sized, mouse-sized creatures that mostly probably were nocturnal. They didn't come out during the day. So this suddenly opens up this niche that was filled by these big dinosaurs, and mammals take off and they just rule the earth after this point. They fill in all of the roles that the dinosaurs played in the environment. And it really, that set things off for us, for mammals. So we divide this up into the tertiary and the quaternary period. The tertiary is the first one. It's right after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And there's lots of mountain building going on, lots of volcanism, earthquakes in the west. A lot of stuff is happening. I mentioned some of this stuff already, but mammals that are bearing live young and maintaining a steady body temperature start to replace the reptiles majorly, right? Become the dominant land creatures. The mammals that bear live young, like ourselves, are in many ways more capable to survive in a wider variety of habitats and temperature zones than things like the marsupials and the monotremes. Angiosperms happen. See, humongous deal. Flowering plants. Think about this. Up until this point, grass is a flowering plant. There were no grasses, which is hard to imagine a landscape today without that. But they replaced the gymnosperms. We still have gymnosperms around, but now suddenly things look modern. Things look like they do today. The mammals, of course, replaced the reptiles. Reptiles are still around. We've got great adaptations, right, like bearing live young. We are warm-blooded. In other words, we can regulate our body temperature if it gets cold out. We have things like insulating body hair, more efficient heart and lungs. Mammals are able to be much more active during cold winter times and hot times than reptiles are, right? The reptiles are way more dependent on the temperature than the mammals are. So mammals really come to rule the earth. Okay, we've got some famous sites where the Cenozoic fossils are found. One of them is the La Brea tar pits out in California, and it's pretty famous because it's a pit of tar. I know you've seen movies where dinosaurs fall into tar pits and die. But yeah, this is a place where lots of fossils have been dug up because things that fell into those tar pits were preserved really, really well. Nearing more recent times in the Cenozoic, there's some huge, huge mammals. Mammals get big. Maybe not as big as the largest dinosaurs that ever lived, but if we look at whales, whales are pretty large creatures, right? They're definitely up there on that end. But we've got things like giraffes, elephants, right? We have large, large mammals today that are taking the place of a lot of those extinct dinosaurs. Then there are some big mass extinctions. Well, I don't want to say mass extinctions, but a lot of really notable organisms go extinct kind of near the end of the last ice age. So this is very, very recently. In North America in particular, we lose the mastodon, the mammoth. Those are big elephant-like looking creatures related to the elephant. We lose the saber-toothed cats, the giant beavers, the giant ground sloths, horses, camels, giant bison. A lot of these things die out on the American continent, the North American continent. And it says here that we don't really have an idea how this happened, but I think today we've kind of narrowed it down. There was large-scale climate change going on, right? The Earth was warming, the ice ages were ending, the last ice age was coming to a close, so plants were changing, habitats were changing, but on top of that, we have tremendous amounts of evidence, in particular for things like the mammoth, that humans hunted them to extinction. Like modern humans wiped out a lot of these creatures. I mean, probably partly because they were scared of some of them, but also partly for food, right? We've got a lot of evidence of hunting mammoths. So that's the end of our time today. Hope you guys enjoyed that, and have a good day.